Wrong. It's over when I say it's over.
There is no nostalgia involved in the video that you are about to hear, as Cell is a god-tier villain, and will always be a god-tier villain. And while Moro is definitely the GOAT, pun perfectly intended for Dragon Ball Super, that's just talking about Dragon Ball Super. So, with all of that said, why is Cell a god-tier villain? Well, we must first start off by talking about why the arc itself wrote him in such a good way. And to start things off, we have to talk about the fact that throughout Dragon Ball history, Cell is really the only villain ever that had so much interactions with so many different Dragon Ball characters at once. And when we actually break this down, originally, Cell had a direct initial conflict with Goku. Even though Goku was not fighting Cell from the very beginning, Cell was essentially created to kill Goku, as was any other android, so he always had a goal and a desire to fight Goku from the very beginning. And then when we look at a character like Gohan, obviously, Gohan was the one that killed him, and when you factor in that Gohan was the character that Cell changed his goals to after he realized that Goku was no longer the strongest, and after Goku resigned. And then when we look at other characters like Piccolo, Piccolo was the first character that actually met Cell, and we learned about Cell from, because he essentially manipulated Cell into giving him information. And because of that, and also because of the fact that Piccolo fused with Kami originally to fight against the androids, but then later on found out about Cell, that's also another interesting thing there too, where Cell was also really the first character to fight against Piccolo after he had transformed, or shall I say fused into his new state after fusing with Kami. And when we look at other characters, we also have the father-son duo of Vegeta and Trunks. And the interesting thing about it is that Vegeta is purely the reason why Cell became perfect, because Cell essentially used his knowledge of Saiyan genetics to manipulate Vegeta, which was an interesting way that he basically was able to attain his perfect form. And when we also factor in that Trunks is probably the most relevant character in fighting against Cell, even more so than Gohan and Goku, because of the fact that both Cell and Trunks technically killed each other twice, and looking at it like that, and the fact that they definitely have more beef throughout the arc than any character, considering the fact that Trunks is going through everything to defeat the androids, there was a very unique divide where Cell had his moment against every single character. And Trunks, because of the fact that Cell manipulated his dad and he thought he had a transformation to defeat Cell, there was always this dynamic that felt like there was unfinished business. And even though Trunks didn't kill Cell in the present timeline, he eventually did it in the future timeline, which really made up for everything else. But it doesn't just end here, guys, because when we look at other villains too, what I love about the Android arc, specifically Cell, is how it encompassed villains into being heroes. Because Cell was such a big threat that 16, 17, and 18, who were all originally trying to hunt Goku, all essentially turned because Cell was a bigger threat to them. And that's something that we really haven't seen too much in Dragon Ball. Obviously, in the future timeline, 17 and 18 remained evil because there was no opposition. 16 was either never used or didn't exist in the future timeline. We did a whole video talking about that specifically. And, obviously 19 wasn't around in the future timeline at all. So when you think about it like that, Cell, specifically, he had his own beef against the androids because Android 16 was the big, strong android who was essentially the big brother of 17 and 18 and was putting himself on the front line to directly counter Cell and to stop him from advancing when Cell was in his imperfect state. And then when we look at 17 and 18, who were the two androids that were necessary in, eventually, helping Cell transform into his perfect form, it was interesting to see that our characters originally had a fight against the androids that completely switched to Cell. And what made the android arc so brilliant and what made Cell so great is how Cell also directly interacted with the minor characters of Dragon Ball. So when we look at characters like Ten Shenhan, or Tien, if you want to go with like his more Americanized name, then you have Krillin, and then you have Mr. Satan. All three of these characters, as minor as they are, played a significant role in the Cell arc and made Cell change and adapt himself as a villain to every different character, because when we look at it specifically of, Tien was holding off Semi-Perfect Cell, which a lot of people today still feel like the power scaling was off, but Tien held him off. And then when you have the moment where Krillin decided to spare 18, because if Krillin didn't decide to do that, that would have changed the entire arc if he destroyed her. And then when we also look at a character like Mr. Satan, who was essentially a minor character, but actually ended up having a significant role because he was the one that threw 16's head. And when you factor in that he took credit for killing Cell, he basically had his own role throughout that arc too, especially with his crew that was more so added for like the anime variation because, some of those guys weren't there, like Miss Pisa and the two goons. It was just basically Mr. Satan and Jimmy Firecracker, and I do like that the anime actually made that difference by adding in those goons because I feel like it just made it a lot more humorous. But it doesn't end there, guys, because another amazing thing about Cell, outside of the fact that he was a villain that was well written in a way that it took so much involvement from other characters, but also the fact that Cell, just like our heroes, has to go through an actual process to attain his power. You see, usually in Dragon Ball, in most cases, you just bump into a villain that can just transform just because they can transform, or they're just strong just because. And even though Frieza is obviously a great villain, that's one of the things about Frieza that's really, really, really different from Cell. Where Frieza just gets forms because he just figures out how to transform, or he just already had it. Whereas when you look at a character like Cell, similar to Baby in Dragon Ball GT, who is still a great villain in his own right, you can talk about GT not having good writing, but the one shining star of GT is Baby Vegeta, and one of the reasons why is because he shares this thing in common with Cell, where he's essentially a character from the very beginning that is not very powerful and has to work on his own way through manipulating the characters, through, being sneaky, doing all of these things, absorbing humans quietly. Cell had to go through all of this when he was in his imperfect form, that he was not as stronger than the stronger characters on the planet, and that eventually, as he got stronger, he had to use different tactics to get stronger, and then eventually with Super Perfect Cell, he basically got stronger by luck because Toriyama essentially forgot that destroying the core of Cell obviously would not kill him, because Goku technically should have killed Cell, but that's another conversation for another day. The point we're trying to get at here is that Cell had to work to get what he had, which is something that a lot of other villains just simply don't have throughout Dragon Ball. And when we also look at the fact that Cell also has a very unique insect-like design, some people can be a believer, you might not believe a believer of it, but one of the interesting things about Cell too is just kind of how you see he becomes a lot more humanoid the more that he perfects his forms, where imperfect Cell looks completely insect-like, and then like his semi-perfect form kind of looks like a big, dumb, imperfect version of himself. And then when you get to Perfect Cell, you see like he actually like looks a lot more human in like this insect-like way. And this also reflects too, because we're not sure if Cell can pop out Cell Juniors when he's in his previous forms, but seeing the fact that the Cell Juniors are essentially replicas or younger variants of what Cell is in his perfect form was also really interesting to see too, because seeing Cell spit out those Cell Juniors was one of the most shocking things throughout Dragon Ball history, and it eventually led to one of the most awesome moments ever of Gohan essentially killing all of them, which is another conversation for another day. But ultimately, the fact that Cell has all of our characters' abilities makes him such a threat when you think about it from a tension point of view, because he can do everything our characters can do and more, because he also has the androids, and because he can basically just spit out kids and create more villains. And when you think about it like that, it really does feel like Cell is like this ultimate villain that nobody can stop. Like, it really feels like out of all Dragon Ball villains that could have been the last villain regardless of power scaling, it would have made the most sense for that final villain to be Cell. And when we look at it from another perspective too, guys, we also have to remember one of the absolute greatest things about Cell, and that is the main fact that his biggest strength was his weakness. The same Saiyan genetics that made him so powerful ultimately led to his ultimate doom, because those same Saiyan genetics made him cocky. He decided to say, I'm so good, I'm gonna make a tournament and test myself against all of you guys who got all of this extra training because I think I'm all that in a bag of chips, and he eventually gets killed by a kid. And the irony of all of that that this villain, who literally was perfect in every single way, loses because of the same thing that made him so perfect in the first place, is just great writing. And ultimately, that's one of the reasons why, even though I like Dragon Ball Super Superhero, seeing Cell return as Max Cell just was not enough. Seeing Cell as a rage monster just took so much away from the brilliance of what made him such a great original villain in the original Dragon Ball manga and Dragon Ball anime. And for all of those reasons, that is why Cell is a god tier villain.